Thank you for the invitation to speak here, give a general overview of microchipping. First, what's inside a microchip? So the intelligent part of the microchip is inside an E-unit where there's an integrated circuit, which is called the silicon portion, and that is connected to the coil inductor, which is a copper wire attached to a ferrite core. That all is supported by resin. Bring the microphone up. A little taller. That is all supported by a resin. And it's enclosed in glass. Usually it's glass 8625, which is a biocompatible glass. Can be other materials as well. And many times it has an extra coating of parylene or polypropylene cap, which will help with adhesion and help avoid migration. The microchips current in the market vary in length from 13 millimeters to 8 millimeters, and in width to 2.1 to 1.4. That means that they're usually delivered with needles that go from 12 gauge to 15 gauge, and consequently the length of the needles in the market vary as well, from around 24 millimeters to 30 millimeters. So right now there's quite a wide variety of microchips in dimensions, in coatings, in materials. So how does it work? The microchip, when you press the button on your reader, you emit a radio wave that goes and is looking for a microchip, and the microchip responds with the embedded material that's inside the IC unit. This goes back to the reader, and the reader can transmit this number back to the computer and then to a database. And you can also have information being uploaded to the computer as well that goes to the reader. So this relationship seems very simple, but in reality, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. The frequency is one that has been discussed quite a bit today. The orientation of that chip. In horses, it's favorable that they are in perpendicular orientation when you implant in the nuchal ligament, different from small animals where the orientation is parallel. But you have other factors. You have the performance of the reader. You have the performance of the chip. You have other factors that can interfere, the presence of metal. So I'm trying to address here a few questions that I received that I see that sometimes there are some questions about. One of those is frequencies. When we mention FDXB, what do we mention? When we mention 134.2, what are we referring to? So the low frequencies go in the range from 120 to 140 kilohertz, and that's the most commonly used. Above that, we have the frequency of like near field communications. That's 13 megahertz. The ultra high frequency tags that we see used in livestock are around 900 megahertz. And then you have the 2.4 gigs, which would be Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and that category. Communication protocol. Don't take this as being the final possibilities, but you have the full duplex, which means the communication is simultaneous between the microchip and the reader. That doesn't mean that a microchip cannot be an HDX. It can. The same way with the EID button that here is an HDX, you can have an EID button that is an FDX. So what is an ISO microchip? It means it's compliant with the ISO standards 11784 and 11785, which we discussed here quite a bit today. But what does it really mean? It means that it will have a frequency of 134.2, It will always have a 15 digits. It will not have any alpha character in it, which the FGXA would be a 9 or a 10 alphanumeric digits. And how do you know that it is an ISO microchip? Because as a manufacturer, I can come out and say my microchip is an ISO microchip. It is following the codes. But in reality, we need a registration authority that says, yes, this microchip is compliant with the ISO standards. And who does that is ICAR. And ICAR will certify if your microchip follows these two standards, the 11784 and the 11785. So the 11784 is going to specify the code structure in the microchip, and the 785 will specify how the reader and that microchip will communicate. So this is an example of how the codes are inside the microchip. Here we have 128 bits total. The ISO standards will refer only to this portion, the ID portion of it, which is 64 bits. The header is a group fixed of bits, which is mostly to help find the reader. CRC are cyclic checks to see if there's any points that aren't communicating as they should. There's the extension portion where you will have other features. For example, the Biothermo feature will be on the extension bit. Those that have data chips also will be on the extension chip bit. Then inside the 64 bits, you have the first bit, which is for an animal transponder. 2 to 15 are not used. The 16 is usually to say, well, you do have an extra information on the extension portion. And from bit 17 to 26, you have the manufacturer, the country code, and the 27 to 64, where there's the identification code. So this is basically what ICAR looks for on this ISO code 11784. So the code structure. We mentioned previously that there's 3 digits. There are going to be the country code or the manufacturing code, even if it's a shared code or not. On the country code, these follow the ISO 3166, which lists all the country codes, and they go all the way to 898. Then the manufacturing code will start in the 900s. So the 900 are the shared ones, and the other manufacturers have it all the way up to 998. 999 is a test code and is used when you're going to use for research or any special use where the manufacturer asks to use those codes. There are some animals that have been microchipped in Europe with 999, but that should not have happened. So, what is an ISO microchip? Again, it's when ICAR is going to come and certify and say that it is an ISO microchip. And they have been founded since 1951, and they're defining the guidelines and the standards and certificates for animal identification. So what they support, and I think these are the 2 main points, the compatibility between manufacturers. And I think that's the most important point, that the importance of having an ICAR certification and following the ISO 11784 and 11785 is so it doesn't happen what we heard here before. Oh, I have this technology, now I have to throw this all away and come to another technology. Now your reader doesn't read my reader. So ICAR is there exactly to standardize that and make sure that my reader can read any other microchip and that our chips can be read by any other readers in the market. The other important point for ICAR registration is the uniqueness of the ID number that is embedded in the microchip. So the way that this process is done is basically by ICAR giving a certificate of conformance, And the way that they grant these certificates is by, first they will examine this microchip. It will go to a lab, an official authorized lab, and the manufacturer at the same time will have to sign a code of conduct. On this code of conduct, we do have to maintain the database of the microchips. The microchips, besides the number that is embedded, has a serial number, and those numbers have to be matched. So, for example, if Katie comes back here with a microchip that already is in another horse, and now you have two identical microchips, the manufacturer is able to match these to the serial number and say, this is the authentic one. So all that is required. So after that, after they examine, they give a certificate of conformance. You get a perpetual registration, and that certificate has to be renewed in 5 years. All this information is displayed by ICAR. So anyone can go and find any of those certified microchips. You can find the certified manufacturers. You can find when those manufacturers signed the code of conduct. So this is a little bit of the buyer's beware, because in the market there are companies that chose not to be ICAR certified. So there's not a formal authority that went there, checked these microchips, and said, yes, they are in conformance with the codes. But they are sold as ISO microchips, and they're out in the market, and they're accessible. So this is a page of the manufacturing codes. And you can see here's the name of the manufacturer, the code that is granted, which when one of these codes is given, you have around 274 trillion combinations of microchips possible for that manufacturer. It will give a product codes, which has nothing to do with the range. It's an FGXB. So it has all the details here until when the certification is valid. So it's very clear and available to all. On the 900 shred code, and I think this is a very important point, they are given 1 million codes to use. So they receive a range of codes that are not duplicates. So the difficulty with the 900 is not as much as having the uniqueness of code, because if they follow the codes that they receive, a duplication should not happen. The main challenge is when you find one of these lines and you go to the manufacturer, how do you connect do the connection of that to the distributor that is in front of you in the United States? You will have probably here a manufacturer in Taiwan that has these ranges. So now what? How do I connect that to somebody that's selling the chip here? And that happens quite frequently, that we receive a code, we have to look it up, we find the manufacturer, but how do you do all those connections afterward? So this is the ICAR website, and I wanted to make it clear so anybody can go up there and look and be sure that a microchip is certified. So if you go in animal identification and you check for a certified RFID, you go down to injectable transponders, and you will see that list of microchips that I showed in the previous pages. I just wanted to bring some different countries that have different ways of placing the codes. France is one of them. They use the country code, the 250. They use a species code that are the two following digits. They use a manufacturer code that is a combination that they do to only use 2 digits. So they transform that 3 digits in 2 digits. But we have to understand with that, they are limiting the number of combinations that are left. But that's an option that that country made. There are other countries that use the country code and then they use, they use the manufacturing code followed by the country code. So they lock 6 digits of the 15. So this is my experience, and I think it's similar to what we heard before with the Frisians. This is a farm that I started taking care of 20-something years ago, and they had 10 Tobiano foals, and then they went to have 70 Tobiano foals a year, and it was a challenge to identify. Usually there's somebody in the farm that knows all, knows who's the mom, knows who's the dad, and if that person isn't there, you're in trouble. We also had to do Coggins for all these foals manually. So I think the great advantage that I see, and we get used to it, we get much impatient today. You get a new product, you don't want to go through the manual. So things that you used to do, you don't want to do anymore. And I think these are one of those, that you arrive at a farm and you just spend so much time in identifying the animals, or if you're in a competition and it takes time for you to check that animal, and we know you might not be checking the correct animal because it's just time consuming. So I think one of the great advantages is in saving time and eliminating human errors for sure. So, chipping in the U.S. So since February 2014, you could have a microchip that was a non-ISO, but after that date, you should be implanting an ISO chip. And that's the only requirement. And with that, you have the market is still open to microchips that might be ISO chips, but might not be ICAR registered, or that maybe could not have the ideal microchip for the equine species. Maybe it's a small chip that has a small reading range. Maybe it's a needle that might be short for the horse. So all of that has to be, in my opinion, reviewed. On the report that came out from USDA on the baseline reference of equine health and management that was conducted in 28 states, where almost 4,000 operations were selected. The data collected represented 71% of the equids and 70.9% of operations with 5 or more equids. And horses residing at racetracks were not included. Microchip was present in only 3.4% of those operations, and only 1.6% of the resident equids. So I think that right now we have larger groups that are establishing their standard, but we have to review if that model will fit the equine population in general, because if that number starts growing, we might have some problems showing up that up to now have not shown up. The other point on this table that I think is interesting is to see that Coggins, 42% had Coggins identification. So back to Dr. Heckendorf's comment, if you could have the Coggins attached to a microchip number, that might be a good solution. So those are just some thoughts. So in discussing the 840 versus the manufacturing code and the 900 shared code, I just wanted to bring some ideas to the table that I'm sure we're going to discuss more in depth. But one of the things is it would limit the implantation to approved USDA devices, and that would limit those non-ICAR registered microchips in the market. The traceability in disease outbreaks would be much easier. The definition of country of origin on those cases with pyroplasmosis in Florida, where you don't know if this horse came from Mexico or if he was chipped inside the U.S. Data permanence, maintenance of that historical data, the horses live 40, 50 years, can live up to 40, 50 years. How will that data stay in these registries? We're dealing with small animals, which the life is much shorter. But what about the companies that go out of business, and how is that data maintained? The data security. So if you have these multiple points, do they present a higher risk of being compromised? If you have this silos with the data, like Summer mentioned, how would these be more risk of being compromised? And premise ID, could there be a different model for equine? Because I understand that was a big pushback of not going with 840 codes because of the premise ID registration. But we ran a trial with the California Horse Racing Board, and the premise ID was the racetrack. So could there be different models, different situations that the premise ID could be in a different, or a racetrack, or similar to a breeding association? With the manufacturing code, we know the advantage that it does not require this premise ID. And it would rely on the private industry to hold data on the equine. The 900 codes, the difficulty with this, it is to, when you find a microchip number, it is much more difficult to identify where it came from, where you have to call. It can mean different distributors. It's sometimes hard to find manufacturer versus distributor. So I think that's a little bit of a challenge. So ICAR will have that information. Once it creates that range, it will keep that range in their database, but he'll not say, well, in the US it sells under that name. So you'll have a manufacturer in China with a name that means nothing to you here, and that can be difficult to find, trace it back. Implantation technique. I know this was brought up, but it is our opinion that the microchip is intended for administration by a veterinarian or under the supervision of a veterinarian, and we understand that there are state laws that regulate it, but we see like the iatrogenic cases of pyroplasmosis, so there should be some guidance at least from a veterinarian on how to do the procedure, because those microchips will stay there in place for many years, and we want to make sure that they're applied with the most aseptic technique. Sedation is generally not required, with exception of nervous horses. Again, there's a big variation in needles in the market. The sharpness of the needles varies with the bevel, varies with the silicone coating. The silicone coating is a medical silicone grade that has to be applied a certain way in the needle. So we generally do not have to sedate a horse, but again, there's a variety of types in the market, and it might be required in some cases. One of the facts that was observed in 2 studies by Derber and by Swinker was that in nervous horses you had a higher chance of having an inflammatory reaction. So we always recommend that it's best to spend a few minutes with a horse, and I know that seems very obvious, but we see it all the time happening where people get anxious and really don't give the time that the horse needs for the procedure. And if the horse needs further restraint, then we would advise to discuss with the owners. So one of the things that has been brought up today is that's very simple. Scan the horse before you implant a microchip. And we see, I have a cat that has 2 microchips. And it happens. The person that is implanting forgets to check, or checks very quickly and doesn't find a microchip, and just goes ahead and implants another one. And again, with that small number of animals microchipped today, this might start happening more in the future. So the first thing is to be sure that the reader that you're using is a universal reader, because as mentioned, there are several horses in the market with the FDXA technology implanted. Identify reading zone of a microchip reader, and that seems also very simple, but I've seen recently a video where a vet was scanning the horse. It wasn't with one of our readers, but they were completely off the reading zone of that reader. So they were pointing it, and the reading zone was in a different area. So identifying the reading zone of the microchip reader, and scan the horse thoroughly on both sides of the neck and perpendicular and parallel to it to be sure there's not a microchip implanted. We have to remember that the mini microchips in general, they have reading distance that is smaller than a standard chip. So once you only require an ISO chip, you're opening to all kinds of microchips, and many of those have a smaller reading distance. If no microchip is detected, scan the microchip product in the pouch and verify that it's the correct number. Check if the pouch hasn't been torn or punctured. And again, I've seen packaging of microchips that weren't open aseptically. They were open like they just put the hand and pulled it out, contaminating the pouch. So we do see situations that it's always good to double check that has not been the case. Identify recommended implantation site. We say it is in the nuchal ligament, but we know that it's not always in the nuchal ligament. Especially with more horses living longer and having more metabolic diseases. We see many of those with cresty necks, and many times you might be implanting on the adipose tissue, and that has been confirmed by 2 studies that encountered the microchip inside the adipose tissue. One was by Wolf, where they detected 3 out of 16 were in the adipose tissue. And again, if the market is open and all lengths of needle can be used, all the small animals, you might have a higher risk of being in adipose tissue. The area of implantation can be shaved. I generally do not shave. I think that many of us have worked with very nice horses where you start shaving too much and then it grows white hair or something similar to that, and you got an enemy on that owner. So I used to shave a lot when I graduated, and gradually I stopped doing that. I scrub very well, but I don't shave. And the use of sterile gloves is recommended. So without touching the needle, remove the cap, ensure that the bevel is facing up, and the needle should be inserted perpendicularly. I have seen colleagues recommending a 15-degree angle. I usually do not recommend it. We recommend it perpendicularly. I've also seen past recommendations of bringing back the syringe and creating space for the microchip, which is not necessary as well. So once it's completely inserted and the microchip is placed, do a slight pressure to the administration site. Rescan and be sure that the microchip has been implanted correctly. I think the other point is the distance to the main. I see a lot of variation on that as well. I see it going from 1/2 inch to 2.5 inches, and I think that might be something for us to discuss further. We have been recommending 1.5 to 2. but it is something that maybe we need to review. So the horse might present a slight discomfort, similar to routine IM injection. He might be sore for a couple of days, but not more than that. I just wouldn't do it just before a race or just before a competition. So I just wanted to bring that there's some new ISO standards that are coming. There's this ISO standard, the 156391, and this creates a standard of injection sites. And the part 1 has come out. It's for companion animals, and it details 2 locations for implantation sites. So the American implantation, and of other countries, of course, that it's in between the shoulder blades, and a European implantation site, which is on the left side of the neck. So now they are working on the implantation, on the standardization of implantation for equine. I know they're reviewing the Canadian implanting on the lips or on the nose, but it will come out eventually for the equine. The data microchips. There's this ISO standard. It already exists in terms of part 1 and part 2. The part 3, which is the memory organization map, is still not published. It's still not final. One important thing, and I've heard this before, and we have to be sure that we understand that the data chips, the ISO portion where the number is embedded, is locked. So that will not be modified. What they have is additional information on the extension portion. The ISO standards will not tell what exactly that data is. That will be according to the country or to the authorities or whoever is going to work on that. What's the validity of that data that is going to be uploaded? Who is going to upload that data? So I think there's a lot of open questions regarding the data chips. And there's not as much flexibility if it's in a database that you just have a number and you can modify the information on the database. Here it's going to be a little bit more complicated. So the AVMA has a statement regarding this type of data chips. And they support the use of them, but only when there's a standardized solution, and that is still not there. There's also a working group for an ISO standard for performance, which they will define how a microchip has to perform, how it has to behave, how it has to pass in certain drop tests, that the glass won't break. So that is a next step that we will see with the ISO standards. Health concerns. The main concerns that I see are the pain on implantation, the inflammatory responses at the implantation site, and the migration. So I think one of the best studies that I know of is from Dr. Gerber, and I think many of you worked with her at the time. This was done between 2008 and 2009 and was published in 2012 at the Equine Veterinary Science. And she did a very nice job in characterizing all those points in the inflammatory response, in the pain response, in the swelling and migration. So the materials that they used were 18 quarter horse mares, and they divided in 3 groups. The group 1 had 7 mares, which would be microchipped. The group 2, 7 mares that would be a sham group, and the group 3 would be a control group. So the microchip group would be naturally implanted. The sham group, they would receive the injection at the same place with the same procedure. They just wouldn't implant a microchip. And the control group, it would go through the scrubs and all that, but would have nothing implanted or injected. So the results of this study were done based on the skin temperature, which was measured with a dermal thermometer, and These were all checked in many different points of the 24 hours, up to 24 hours, and then daily for 2 weeks. So the swelling area, they measured just whatever area was swollen, and they did a pressure threshold, which they used an algometer, to quantify the pressure to induce the pain. And they used blood samples for SAA, which is a biomarker for inflammation, which increases and decreases more rapidly than the fibrinogen. So the responses that she found was that the skin temperature, there were no detectable differences in between microchip, sham, and control groups. The pain threshold, the horses that were implanted did exhibit more sensitivity compared with the horses in the sham and control groups. They were a little bit more sore. The swelling, when it occurred, it began 2 hours after implantation, and the control group present no swelling. And SAA, they had 2 horses that exhibited elevated concentrations, but they were linked to other conditions. So there was no correlation between local inflammatory reactions and SAA concentrations. So swelling and increased sensitivity to pressure resolved within 3 days. In another study by Swinker, they did have 6 horses that reacted among 307 horses with swelling, but with 24 hours all those reactions were dissipated. None of the horses had abscesses, and 4 horses exhibited a slight bump at the implantation site. Again, these horses were all microchipped with guidance or through veterinarian support. Different what we might see in the market in the future. Regarding migration, in the horses with the nuchal ligament implantation, the chances of migration are much slimmer. But again, if we're using different types of needle, possibly shorter needles, or implanting on adipose tissue, there might be a higher risk. But on these cases, on Dr. Gerber's study, they measured the 4th cervical vertebrae to the microchip and took x-rays. And with that, they did a linear regression of these values, and they found that the slope was not significantly different from 0, so the microchips did not migrate at all. That was a very nice work that she did. And there's another study done by Dr. Stein, where 53 of these horses were implanted, and there was no migration, but at the same time, these were done only with the reader, and the reader is not the ideal to measure if there was any movement or not. They were in the same area, but it wasn't as precise as the previous study, which measured with the 4th cervical vertebrae. Temperature sensing microchip. She really is measuring a temperature on the foal, and it is the same farm. And they do regularly measure temperatures twice a day in all the foals. And they really loved having a temperature sensing capability in the microchips, just because of the number of horses. It's not a substitute for a physical exam where you have one data point of temperature. But when you're monitoring several animals, and you're understanding each individual temperature and storing those. And on top of that, we had always that somebody would go out there, measure all temperatures, and come back and say they're all normal. And now you have a memory which shows what time they measured what temperature and what that temperature was, who was that animal. So it has been of great advantage, understanding its limitations, of course. So the temperature sensing microchip, it is still an identification device, And I understand that there's not a wish of change of technology. No, it's ISO 784, 785. So it is exactly like a regular microchip, but it has a portion of it where it will have a temperature sensing capability. It will have a semiconductor, and it's integrated into the IC circuit. This was a very innovative work from long time ago from Destron Fearing. When Allflex acquired Destron Fearing, they thought it was a very nice innovation, but they also thought that it needed to be re-engineered to improve its accuracy. So the comments that we had before, it was a fact that first generation of the biothermals weren't as accurate as the newer generation. So now one of the things that was done, the biothermal is calibrated at 38 degrees. And so that is the highest point of accuracy. So now the readers will limit their reading capability between 33 and 43 to not go away from where the accuracy is the best. So again, it's in the extension trailer, as would the data be. So now on the newer version of the biothermal, we have a study by Langer and Feets in 2014, which they detected the accuracy of the biothermal of being 0.07 plus minus 0.12 Celsius. So it was much improved compared to the first generation. We also sent out studies for an independent lab in France called Tirana, and they did 2 studies for us this year. The first study was comparing it to a reference thermometer, this platinum resistance thermometer, and 10 biothermal microchips were used. They were placed in immersion at 5 centimeters depth, and temperatures were measured at 33, 38, and 43 degrees, which are the ranges that the readers will read. And measurements were taken every 30 seconds. So this is what was found on that study. So in absolute terms, at 38 degrees, you have an accuracy of 0.08. At 42 degrees, 0.04. And it's lower when it's in the lower temperatures in the 33 Celsius. This was a second study performed when we added to the reference thermometer thermometers that are in general use, which were the Walgreens, the AdTemp, and the Welch and Allen thermometers. And this is the finding, and you can see that they travel very close to each other. So I want to share other findings in other cases. So this is in foals. So this was a study with 15 foals with ages between 6 and 8 months old. Microchip temperatures and rectal temperatures were measured twice a day, with only one person measuring with one thermometer with one reader. The environmental temperatures were very stable, between 55 degrees and 75 Fahrenheit. So 660 temperatures were collected, 330 were microchip temperatures, and 330 were rectal temperatures. It presented a mean of 99.46 with a standard deviation of 0.52. The rectal temperatures presented a mean of 100.25, a little bit of a wider standard deviation of 0.75, and the average difference between both was of 0.79 Fahrenheit. I think the important message here is that they travel together, and you can have much more temperatures with a microchip temperature. So if you're checking a foal and his temperature is elevated, you can retemp him every 10 minutes. And you can ask somebody to do that and get that information even online. On this particular case, on the second day that the temperatures were higher, that was a foal that was very sick and had very high temperatures. It was not environmental temperature. So these are individual foals, and as you can see, there might be a difference in a certain foal in terms of rectal to microchip temperature, but the pattern is very similar. So the important analysis on the microchip temperature is the change. So where you see a peak on the microchip temperature is where you see a peak on the rectal temperature, although the numbers are different. I also asked for Lynn Ennis. He's using it in some of their horses, and I asked him to share some of those temperatures to see it in different locations. So these were 442 temperatures collected at the same time that they had the rectal temperatures. And as you can see, the mean temperature was a bit higher, but again, the patterns of the microchip temperature and the rectal temperature follow each other very closely. And the other studies that we have, and these are ongoing studies, and these are with Dr. Claire Cicluna, and they are done at the Equine Institute. She did one of these studies, had 4 healthy horses, and they had the temperatures measured every 30 minutes from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So again, rectal temperature was measured with a digital thermometer, and the microchip temperature was measured within one of our scanners. I thought it just was interesting that the other day I was seeing a study where digital thermometers were considered not very accurate, so that you would have to use mercury thermometers. And then it just remembered me when I graduated that the first digital thermometers, if you were carrying one of those around, didn't look like you were very serious because they were not as accurate. So I think now with the collection of data and the amount of information that you can have with understanding the pattern, if the temperature is going up, if the temperature is going down, it is similar to what happens in the human market with the frontal temperature, where you can use it to scan, but if you have to have a more detailed physical exam, then you use the rectal temperature. So again, she found very similar patterns. There are some situations where when they go a little bit in different directions, where the rate of change on the microchip might be different to the rate of change on the rectal. I've seen a case of that, especially with hypothermia, where you have the periphery vasoconstriction. So the microchip might first have a lower temperature than the rectal, and then the rectal lowers as well, decreases as well. So she did this study where these temperatures were collected 4 times a day, early in the morning, during the training period, the rest phase, and the end of the day. And I think this is a very interesting study, and where you see the blue is the microchip temperatures. That's the number of temperatures that you can collect with the microchips. The reds are the rectal temperatures, and again, they're traveling together. They have the same pattern. You can collect much more temperatures with the microchip temperatures. You can collect it basically when the horse is just arriving from exercising, which would be more challenging with the rectal temperature. And you can see the points where there might be concerns or not. And in reality, we don't have that with rectal temperature. I'm not aware of any study that has that level of detail, how you would expect that to happen 24 hours a day. And considering different sports and different breeds. So then we can go to just the microchip temperature monitoring, where that is where it interests us the most, where you can see the patterns. On the top one, you have a healthy 3-year-old sport horse, where he has these peaks and when he goes out to exercise and possibly even the agitation in the stall, his temperature fluctuates a lot. And you have a 28-year-old female that has COPD, and her temperature has very little fluctuation. And again, I don't know of studies of rectal temperatures that we could compare those many readings and comparing them to different diseases. So the biothermo is a practical and safe method to collect temperatures from several animals, but it would act as a monitoring tool, not as a one-point measurement. The evaluation of microchip temperatures should take into consideration the rate of change and for each individual. So as we saw all those peaks, those are the alerts for us. And the collection of temperatures eliminate human errors. Like I said, I think it's very common to ask for clients to measure the temperature, and it's always normal. So that would be eliminated, and you would have that temperature stored.